welcome everyone, and thank you for joining. This is our second session of our New Frontiers webinar series, and we are really pleased that you could join us here today. My name is Debra Haire-Joshu, and I'm the Joyce and Chauncey Bushite Professor of Public Health at Washington University, and direct the NIDDK-funded WashU Center for Diabetes Translation Research, and the co-sponsor of this webinar series. And we are really thrilled today to have Dr. William Masters, who's going to be presenting on healthy diets and food pricing and diet costs and affordability worldwide, presenting some of his outstanding global work. This session is part of a larger webinar series entitled New Frontiers to Prevent Diabetes and Malnutrition and Opportunities for Global to Local Impact. And as part of that series, we're really looking to invite leaders in the field who can give us the latest perspectives on the work that they're doing and public health opportunities and to inform the prevention of malnutrition and diabetes and undernutrition. And we're doing this as a co-sponsor with the E3 Nutrition Lab here at the Brown School, which is led by Dr. Laura Ionati, who some of you know. She's in Haiti right now, and the last time I talked with her was in a traffic jam caused by gangs, and so she was safe, but was regretted she's going to be unable to be here. So if she pops in, great, but I have a feeling she's not going to be here. A few housekeeping notes before I introduce our speaker. This recording, which we're doing right now, this recording of the session will be available on the CDTR website. And any questions or comments during the presentation, please add them to the chat. And Dr. Masters welcomes that, and we'll be happy to do questions and answers around that as well. So let me introduce our speaker then. Dr. Will Masters is a professor in the Friedman School with a secondary appointment at Tufts University Department of Economics. And his research uses economic methods to inform and improve food systems, especially in developing countries. He is the co-author of a textbook entitled Economics of Agricultural Development, World Food Systems and Resource Use, and is the former editor-in-chief of the Journal of Agricultural Economics. He was named the International Fellow of the African Association of Agricultural Economists, has been awarded the Bruce Gardner Memorial Prize for Applied Policy Analysis, has an award for a publication of enduring quality. I wish I could get one of those. That one sounds like a very good award. And the Quality of Research Discovery Award. So he's got a lot of awards. We are thrilled to have him talk to us today. And I'm going to turn it over to him for his talk. And please feel free to chat in the chat, and he will respond accordingly. So Dr. Masters, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Debra, thank you very much. And thanks everybody for joining. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks to Laura. It sounds rough in Haiti, but I know she does great work internationally. So I'll talk about international things, but I hope that there's a lot of connection to the U.S. work that you do. So it's really great to see Dr. Kumanika here and many others whose work I've admired. I'm an economist, so I came to the Friedman School of Nutrition on the health science campus at Tufts only in 2010. Previously, I'd been working on economics about agriculture and farm incomes and productivity, markets, trade. But in the 90s, like many of you growing up, whenever, I don't know, different vintages of people coming at nutrition, I just watched slack-jawed as the epidemic of diet-related diseases took off around me. I was teaching at Purdue at the time in this College of Agriculture, and internationally as well. And in the 90s, we started to get much more data about nutrition. I was following nutrition quite closely and started to write papers about it in the late 90s and the 2000s. And the work that you'll see here is kind of the most recent set of discoveries on this topic of cost and affordability of healthy diets that I hope you find interesting. I hope you find informative for your own work, whether it's in the US or internationally. So, in the health sector, we don't do this in other sectors, but important to say where your money comes from. So this work is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and also the UK Development Assistance Group. And we do have additional funding from international agencies and from USAID. So the basic question for today is, to what degree can your challenges in whether it's diabetes prevention or other forms of malnutrition could be informed by thinking about access differently from the way that one would in a health behavior context. So we have many decades, in fact centuries, of work on why do people eat what they eat? What can they afford? What is effective demand for each type of food? We know that people say and do want healthy food, but we also know that people don't know what's in food and how it would affect them. And even if they did know, they have other goals as well. So it's clearly not true that people only seek health, and it's not true that even if they did seek health, that they would know how to get it. And so there's this very interesting difference between what people want and need to buy and what would be good for them in terms of health. So I'm building on these generations of economics research where we think about prices and how those differ. So those are the same for everyone in a community. Typically, you go to the grocery store, there's people at the checkout with very different levels of income, but you're all facing more or less the same prices. And then given the prices and the incomes, what do people choose, which is based, of course, on tastes and preferences, on your food culture, what you believe about health. There will be people, in this checkout line for a supermarket who have just very different beliefs about the value of what's in their cart for themselves and for their own health. But then there's also very different levels of meal preparation costs. Some people, working 2 jobs, taking the bus, when they need to buy something at the grocery store, they need to be on the table for the kids, in 10 minutes. And other people might be looking forward to an hour of cooking at home. So as economists, we're inferring preferences from the actual behavior. And we know, and you've probably seen, a set of price and income elasticities as people adjust when prices or incomes change. That's what we call demand system estimation. And you've probably seen quite a lot of food choice experiments where people try to elicit, are people willing to pay for something? So what I'm doing is something different. This is something new that came out of the work that I'll describe, where we're asking, what foods are people not buying because they just don't have enough income to buy it? So we cannot discern these unaffordabilities, these access questions, just by looking at food choice. It's a different thing. So we began around 2016, and our method is to look at the least expensive items that would meet a health criterion. So it's a modeled diet, and you've probably seen least cost diets in various settings, but we're calculating literally millions of them. So hundreds and hundreds of thousands of least cost diets tells us whether people could buy a healthy diet or if they can't. So these metrics have been adopted in ways that I'll share with you in a minute. You can, if you're curious, if this is interesting to you, just Google it. You'll find our project website. You can also download a lot of it from the international organizations, UN agencies, led by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, and also the World Bank, with whom we work on this. So the basic point is to diagnose why people have unhealthy diets around the world. Most of us do, for one reason or another, and we're trying to diagnose them and provide remedies. So the distinction, the differential diagnosis, comes from seeing where the prices for even the least expensive item that would be healthy is very high. If that's the case, it's a supply problem, and people are not able to afford a healthy diet because supply is lacking. Production or distribution should be improved to reduce costs. Maybe prices are normal, but incomes are low. In that case, people need jobs or assistance, social protection. A clear distinction, either prices are high or incomes are low. But it turns out that for a lot of us, as you can imagine, prices are normal, incomes we could buy, but people do not, because healthy items are displaced by unhealthy items. So then it's a question of food choice. So we're trying to distinguish between prices, incomes, and food choice as causes of poor diets. And I'm sure this resonates, I hope this resonates with longstanding work that many of you have done. And the question is whether these international data are informative to you. But I actually want to start with some US data, which economists, I think, provide an unusual perspective on food choice relative to people who are in health science, in part because we just have a lot of data. So I'll share data that's over decades and kinds of things that you might not have seen before. So let's start with this. Just to be really clear, when people go and buy food, mostly what they're buying is not the food. This chart shows you what the USDA calls the food dollar, which is the percent of consumer price, so from 0 to 100 cumulatively. Only 9.8% of the consumer dollar, a dime out of a dollar bill, is the farm product, the farmer's work and the land that the farmer is operating. 6% is the inputs and energy. 31% is the processing and packaging of the food manufacturer. 5% is just their financial services of the food manufacturer. 23% is the wholesale trade and transport. 22% is the retailer, the grocery store with its refrigeration and staffing costs and facilities. And almost 3% is just the advertising. That's for groceries at home. Then for food beverages away from home, even more is advertising, and only 1.3% is the food itself. So just to be clear, when we talk about food, we're talking about branding. We're talking about most of the expense is not the food itself. If you just want to buy food, then you're buying much less of all this stuff for the basic generic, which is much less expensive than the premium branded items. Furthermore, when we talk about food spending, in the United States, many other countries, an enormous amount of that is the food away from home, where the food itself is, as you saw, a very much smaller fraction. So this chart shows you the real spending level, total amount spent in real terms, so adjusting for inflation, roughly speaking, the volume of services in the food we buy. In the green is food at home at grocery stores. In the orange is food away from home. The data actually begin at the start of the Great Depression, 1929, when in 2017 prices, people were spending about $4 a day on food at home on average in the United States and $1 away from home. You see them both growing in the 30s and 40s. But from the 50s through the 90s, there was a long period in which the real spending per day in the grocery store was flat and the food away from home began to rise in the 60s. So this is the era of the drive-through, the invention of McDonald's, the growth of fast food, and then in this era, fast casual takes off, and throughout this time, there's lots of innovation in food away from home. But interestingly, grocery spending began rising in the US in the 90s. So people spending more on groceries and food away from home reached half. So the point is that in the United States, we have been spending more than ever in real terms on groceries. Grocery spending for food at home rising since the 90s continuously. People want to spend money on food. People do spend more money on food. People want health when they buy food. The question is, are they getting it? So another thing that people often think about and care about is price spikes, a bout of inflation, when there's a burst of increased prices. So this chart shows you in blue the grocery price index in the United States, starting at 100 back in 1990. The brown is restaurant prices. The light blue is wholesale prices for processed foods. And the green is food itself, just the farmer wholesale price. And what you notice is how restaurant prices are basically just wages and rent. And groceries are varying very close to overall inflation. So 100 would be that it tracks inflation in house prices, automobiles, energy. If it tracks all those things exactly, it would stay at 100. And you see that grocery prices is not far off 100. In contrast, the wholesale prices, that's the thing that is very volatile for farm incomes. So we do have food price crises. They're a real thing. You'll read about them, you'll experience them. It matters a lot. This is the US food price index, the overall CPI, consumer price index for all foods. And you can see how these spikes are famous episodes of relative prices for food becoming unusually scarce. So the 2008, 2009 financial crisis and that recession, 2010 and 2011, 12 was another price spike, a big price spike here. And then these two most recent ones are almost as high as the peak back here. But the point is that even when food prices are normal or low, there's lots of people who are priced out of even being able to have food choice drive their diet quality. So that's what we're going to investigate and try to understand. This Food Prices for Nutrition project, we aim to monitor access, distinguish between access, what could you buy, from what people actually buy, using these least expensive items. So it's a new way of adding up prices with different weights, not the consumer price index that adds up weights proportional to what people actually eat, but just the cost of food as an input to health. So what we did is to try to distinguish among the elements of health, so as to take the least expensive ones. You can imagine this, this sort of ladder of affordability as people begin in the world as the very lowest income people, in history, ancient history perhaps, or recent history, currently now for tens of millions of people. Caloric adequacy itself is a struggle. So there are tens of millions of people around the world for whom just avoiding weight loss is a terrible, takes all their effort every day. Tens of millions of people in South Sudan, in other parts of East Africa and the Sahel region of Africa, especially. And then there's a whole set of other goals, lots of other goals, right? And our work has been to try to distinguish between them, identifying these two steps towards health that are familiar to everybody in the nutrition community, but not that well understood outside nutrition. So first, there's the DRIs. Above the lower bound, the RDA or even the EAR for micronutrients, and then below the upper levels for toxicity or excess. And in our work, we also consider the AMDRs, the macronutrient distribution ranges that are an upper lower bound for carbohydrates, fats, and total protein. So that's this blue nutrient adequacy standard. But we know from epidemiological evidence and also mechanistic studies that there's a lot more to healthy diets than just avoiding inadequacy or excesses. There's a lot of bioactive compounds in food groups that are not essential nutrients, but do affect health. There's qualities of lipids, there's attributes of anti-nutrients that harm health, and there's fiber, of course, and many, many bioactive compounds that are in vegetables, fruits, and so forth. So that's what dietary guidelines are for. So our definition of healthy diets refers to dietary guidelines by food group. And then there's, of course, the added cost of any other goals that people would have. So this is very recent, comes from a first paper in the American Journal of Agricultural Economics, thinking about the cost of reaching diet diversity with the least expensive items. Then we rolled out a series of many other studies trying to address every concern that people had about what does it mean to use least cost model diets, to ask about access, and then this partnership with the UN agencies that do this annual Food Security Nutrition in the World report. We wrote a background paper and informed their method for an initial estimate that used 10 countries' guidelines. I'll show you what those are in just a second. That was a method we called the cost of recommended diets. And then when the UN agencies wanted to have an annual monitoring, we needed a method that would allow them to take updated data from each country every year and compute it. So we created this healthy diet basket, which is a composite of, turns out 31 different dietary guidelines. And that composite, I'll show you in just a bit, has 11 of the least expensive items in 6 different food groups. So you can see the idea is to distinguish access from food choice by taking the least expensive items that would meet a dietary standard and making sure that that dietary standard reflects the consensus of nutrition and public health authorities in the national governments. So for the US, it's dietary guidelines for Americans. I expect there have been people on this call or been on dietary guidelines advisory committees, a part of that process. The evidence library, and how countries around the world share those evidence libraries in each of their dietary guidelines processes. So by having a healthy diet basket that's based on many countries, we get a kind of global consensus around what is a healthy diet. And I'll show you what that is. But clearly, this is very different from actual food choice. So actual food choice for the world as a whole is a lot more than these least expensive items. So actual food choice is about $5.50 a day. You just saw what it was in the US. Healthy diets average cost $3.30. Just nutrient adequacy around $2.50. And just energy around 83 cents. Okay, so you get the idea of what these least cost diets are, and I'll show you some examples in just a minute. So the standard comes from initially these 10 different dietary guidelines. This is the US, of course, as you see here. Sometimes the dietary guidelines of a country kind of use an image representing their cultural reference point. So this is Benin in West Africa. Many still use pyramids, which the US thankfully abandoned in the 2000s, to go for a plate mode, which is the principal food guide around the world. And I expect, some of you have participated in the design of these food guides and try to, communicate clearly what are these food groups and how much of them is needed for a healthy diet. So when we're doing costing, we need to convert these food group categories, which are communicated to the public in either volume terms like cups, or in weight terms like grams, or in a kind of volume and weight combination like a serving, 5 servings of fruits and vegetables or something like that, to allow substitution between carrots, tomatoes, onions within the vegetable category. We need to convert to calories, because otherwise, if you were doing it by weight, you would get vegetables with very different water weight or fruits with very different water weight. And what we want is the vegetable in the vegetables to make sure that the solid matter, that is the bioactive compounds, in contrast to the water weight, is substituted 1 for 1 to get the least expensive. So you get the least expensive food within each by converting these dietary guidelines into calorie shares for energy balance in the population. What's really striking about this is that guidelines differ a lot by country in terms of how they look and how they're communicated to the public. But the food group requirements, like the definition of what is a vegetable and how much of a vegetable you need, is actually surprisingly similar. If you read all countries' dietary guidelines, as my colleague Anna Herforth has done, so a lot of this builds on her work, a paper in 2018 that was a review of global dietary guidelines at that time. And then she's the one who led this quantification of dietary guidelines. So Anna Herforth is the, I think, really first person to sort of notice just how similar these were, and to provide this quantification in terms of calories that allows us to cost them. So in the 2020 report, we had only 2 that were quantifiable. For the 2022 report, a lot of new countries coming on, producing their new dietary guidelines. We have a single healthy diet basket built on 31 guidelines. The method was refined through a variety of workshops with different people, and here's what it looks like. So I mentioned 11 different items: 2 starchy staples, 3 vegetables, 2 fruits, 2 animal source foods, and only 1 legume, nut, or seed, and 1 typically vegetable oil, because that's the least expensive. With these calorie targets that give you, so it's relatively few vegetables, few calories of vegetables, but that's a lot of vegetables, right? So 110 calories of vegetables is, exceeds the WHO guideline in terms of grams and other guidelines in terms of servings, because of course vegetables have a lot of water weight. Similarly with fruit, and then animal source food, doing it in terms of energy means you can substitute milk for eggs, for meat or fish quite freely. So in terms of weight, it would be like this, and in terms of plate share, it's roughly a quarter each. And you can imagine what this looks like. But if you want to cost it, you do need to take the step of going to energy shares. So actual food supplies in the world, the supply-demand balance, how much is produced and purchased around the world, of course, is very far from these targets. The horizontal line is the target. That is this composite from all food-based dietary guidelines. And the colored lines refer to each regional average. So remember, the 6 food groups are starchy staples, animal source foods, oils and fats, fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and seeds. And then there's a 7th group not needed for health, but awfully nice to have, which is dessert, which is a snack, which is discretionary foods that could be salty snacks or sweets. So here, this is sweets. Here, this is essentially sugar, because this is a compilation of all the food products, not the packaged final products, but all the food that goes into the packaged or food away from home. And what you see is that starchy staples are not that far around the healthy diet basket line, with North America, which is in the UN definition is the US, Canada, and Bermuda, because Bermuda is very far north, as you might know. So those 3 countries, of course, Bermuda is very small, and the US is much larger than Canada. So it's essentially the United States. We have quite a bit less starchy staple. We increased sharply our starchy staple consumption, as you might know, during the anti-fat era. We had what I sometimes call an epidemic of low-fat muffins, where people just sharply increased our consumption of starchy staples during that low-fat era here. But that ended, and we remain below other regions' levels of bread and rice and potato consumption. Animal source foods off the charts. North America is an outlier with much more. Europe and Central Asia climbed very quickly, but stopped their increase in animal source foods. East Asia and the Pacific, up like a rocket, rising from these very low levels of animal source foods to, not quite as high as Latin America, but almost. Oils and fats, the United States, we love fried food. We eat a lot of fried food. And so does Europe. These all rose very, very sharply throughout this last half of the 20th century and the first 20 years of this century. Fruits, stubbornly below the healthy diet basket target. Vegetables rising to it and above it, in East Asia, quite remarkably. Legumes, nuts, and seeds still far below what dietary guidelines all recommend. It is stunning that dietary guidelines are recommending levels that are so far above what people actually consume, with very few exceptions in these populations. And in the discretionary, you see the US is really an outlier, US and Canada, but primarily the US. So, we see this remarkable finding that despite all the spending, we're buying something that isn't very healthy, and we have to understand why, and that's our work. So when we do this globally, we end up with these targets. Remember, 2 items totaling 150 calories, 2 fruits, 80 calories each, and so forth. The areas are going to show the share of cost. Okay, so you're going to have a bunch of these donut charts that show the share of cost. And I'm going to start with just one country you might know something about, a South Asian country. Here's the least expensive items in this country. And this is as of 2017, the most recent available data, because this kind of data is very fiddly and takes some time to process. The next available round will be from 2021, and then 2022 data will come out in 2024. So what are the least expensive? Animal source foods, buffalo milk, live chicken, starchy staples, You can kind of guess. Red lentils are low cost in that country. Vegetable oils, typically low cost. Onions, carrots, water spinach, and bananas and coconuts. Let's travel over to a similar similar level of hot and dry climate in Senegal, but a very different culture, right? Very different setting in many ways. So Senegal is a Sahelian country in West Africa, right by the ocean, but there's no refrigeration. So you're looking at a very different set of animal foods you can compare. Similar grains, a different legume, and palm oil is the least expensive. But notice that onions and carrots are in common. And you notice that the cost shares are a little bit different, where the cost shares for vegetables are just really high in Senegal. Total cost level is a lot lower than in Pakistan, but the cost shares differ. Now I'm going to show you two rich countries. Start with Italy. Italy, you might know, is the land of Parmalat milk, boxed milk, right? The ultra high temperature, ultra pasteurized boxed milk that we don't usually get in the US, but is very inexpensive in Italy. And their chicken, to be inexpensive, is frozen. That just is the way it turns out to be. Pasta is very inexpensive. White beans, very inexpensive. Carrots and onions still there, and bananas still there. So bananas, carrots, and onions are the blockbusters of the fruit and vegetable category. They come at as least cost items consistently all around the world. In the US, we have very low cost dairy. It's there. We take it for granted, but as a source of animal source foods, it's much lower cost than most other animal foods, than any other animal food in this data set. So you can see how the least cost diets look. This diet would not give you a healthy eating index of 100 points out of 100. This is not meeting the dietary guidelines for Americans, because the dietary guidelines for Americans call for half your grains to be whole grains, which these are not, and calls for many other things that the healthy diet basket is not. So our global healthy diet basket is this kind of least common denominator among all the world's dietary guidelines. It's not, any one country is typically a little bit more expensive to reach because it has some specific requirements. But the US has a dairy requirement that's not the cost driver. The dairy requirement in the US does not raise the cost of meeting dietary guidelines. It doesn't, because dairy is very inexpensive. What raises the cost of meeting US dietary guidelines would be the whole grains requirement and other aspects of it. Okay, so a common question is, do these diets achieve the RDA for each person? Or do they even achieve the estimated average requirements for a whole population? Remember, EAR is 50% of the DRI requirements for lower bounds, and RDAs would be 95% of the requirements. So the answer is almost always yes. If you meet these food group requirements, you will meet the DRI requirements for micronutrients and macronutrients, but not always exactly. So we're continuing to work on that question of fortification and aspects of these foods that might not exactly meet DRI requirements for micronutrients. So here is the result, the finding, which just knocked my socks off. Like, I was just astonished by this discovery. You're looking at a cloud of dots, right? The green squares are the cost of a healthy diet in each country, meeting the food group requirements only. The blue dots, circles, are the cost of nutrient adequacy. And the open circles are the cost of energy sufficiency. Along the horizontal axis, you have national income, the total amount of goods and services circulating in each country's economy, at purchasing power parity prices, meaning in real terms, adjusting for inflation and the price level of each country. Again, these are old data now, it's from 2017, And our country work within countries is all using 2023 data, but the international comparisons, unfortunately, the next version will be 2021, and that will come out only next year, 2024. So the finding is that food costs differ among countries, but they're not lower in low-income countries. It's just not true that food is on sale if you have a low income. If you walk into a grocery store in the United States and you have a low income, food's not on sale for you. And if you're someone in a low income country like Niger or Chad or Nepal, food is not low cost for you. This is confusing because if we travel to those countries, it appears to be low cost. And the principal reason is because the exchange rate at which you change your currency is not this purchasing power parity. If you were in that country earning that income, it would not be low cost. If you're comparing it to house rents or haircuts or any other cost in that country, it's not low cost. So that central finding that food is expensive in low income countries really drives our results. It turns out around 3 billion people in the world cannot afford an overall healthy diet. And there's also a lot of interest in sort of how these differ and change that we can talk about. How does this compare to actual spending? The stars here, the asterisks, are the actual spending level of every country as a share of their, in absolute levels in dollars per day. The global average that I mentioned to you before, $5.64 per day, but low-income countries spending much less than that. So you can see how the national average spending in these very, very low-income countries is just barely enough to have the population survive. Cost of energy, the basic energy, the circles here. It's only when you get into middle-income countries and then in high-income countries that the average exceeds the healthy diet cost. So this average spending, of course, is just that. And there's plenty of people within these countries who might be down in this area. We could talk about how this would relate to United States income distribution and so forth in a bit. It's also important to compare to any thinking you might be doing about food insecurity. And like, what is food insecurity? How does this compare? How does unaffordability, this new idea of unaffordability, compare to the older idea of prevalence of food insecurity? And you might be kind of familiar with the history of food insecurity measurement, where Kathy Radimer, PhD student at Cornell University in the 1980s, had just come back from working in West Africa, and she saw the US recession of 1983-84 and realized people were not able to afford food in the United States. And she developed these questionnaires where you ask people, did you skip a meal? Did you go to bed hungry? Did you worry about where you got food? Did you did you eat less than you wanted? Did you eat differently than you wanted? For lack of money to buy food, for lack of money to buy your usual diet, did you skip a meal, go to bed hungry, and all those questions? So Kathy Radimer tested dozens and dozens of questions, many long interviews with people that she reports in an extraordinary dissertation. Actually, just reading it is an amazing experience because she talked to so many people about their hunger in the United States and what was hunger in the United States. And she realized that this question of asking people, did you run out of food? Did you go to bed hungry? Did you skip a meal? Did you eat less? Because of running out of money, that really captured it. So our unaffordability measure drops very precipitously because these healthy diet basket foods are actually available in high-income countries. But in low-income countries, people are not able to buy them at all. In contrast, this Kathy Radimer style measure of prevalence of food insecurity in the sense of did people run out of money to buy their usual diet, that's much lower than unaffordability in the very poor countries, but much higher than unaffordability in the rich countries. So there's lots of people in the US who say they ran out of money to buy food, but they absolutely could buy a healthy diet basket. It would not be hard for them to buy a healthy diet, but that's not anyone's idea of an acceptable diet. They'd rather go hungry than eat that. So the food insecurity comparison is really, really useful and very important, because people would prefer to skip a meal, go hungry, and so forth, rather than to eat this healthy diet basket. So if you're doing this kind of work in the US, you need to not use our healthy diet basket because our healthy diet basket is for a different purpose. In the US, you would need to use a higher quality diet like the Thrifty Food Plan of the United Nations, of the FAO, of the USDA. Excuse me, the Thrifty Food Plan is an example of a diet that meets the dietary guidelines for Americans, is quite a lot more expensive than our healthy diet basket that these data come from, but is what you would use in the US context. Okay, so what do we have as results? And then I think, good time for conversation and discussion. I hope that you find that this sort of global perspective, when we think about the least expensive items, in the top right, you just have photos of like what these would be around the world, the least expensive items to meet this kind of composite dietary guideline. It's not a guideline itself, it's just a target that's the least common denominator among all of the guidelines. It tells you that a lot of people are very far from being able to buy this. So 40% of humanity they cannot afford this. This is way above their income level. Why? It's because these foods are just more expensive to grow and distribute. They're perishable, they're bulky, they're expensive and hard to grow. These foods are easy to grow. We've spent decades breeding them to an astonishing degree of yield and yield stability and climate resilience, for cereals, for starchy staple, for leguminous grains, and for vegetable oils too. There's no picture of vegetable oils here, but it's just a miracle of science to have low-cost vegetable oils. But that is not a healthy diet. These healthy diet elements are more expensive to grow and distribute. So we can find where and when these prices are relatively high, and this work is funded by the agriculture departments of Gates and UK, where they want guidance on which food groups in what places. But most of the world's unaffordability is not because of high prices. Most of the world's unaffordability is because of low incomes. And so it's about the safety net and the social assistance programs that you provide. You cannot solve the problem of access to healthy diets just with lower cost. You have to accompany it by safety nets and social assistance. But in a place like the United States, Europe, even Mexico, healthy diets are, in quotes, affordable in this sense, this very specific sense that you could acquire that low quality but nonetheless healthy dietary pattern. You could acquire that, but you don't want to. People don't want to. People don't choose to. People don't have to. It's not a dignified diet. It's not anything you would want. So this is really telling us something that might be obvious to you. Like maybe you're like just listening to all this and you're like, yeah, we know this. This is obvious, right? But there's a lot going on here as people move from inadequacy to excess of sodium, refined grains and sugar, and so forth. Characteristically, human beings just way overshoot on animal source foods. And that displaces these bioactive compounds that you would want from these other foods. We way overshoot on sweeteners and oils. And that's true even for home-cooked meals. But of course, we're switching away from home-cooked meals very early in US history, as you saw, and currently now, to a food industry that is taking a perfectly healthy product and making it unhealthy. And that's such that, for quite some time, the dietary guidelines for Americans have advised people to limit their eating away from home. That's literally the advice. Don't go to restaurants. That's stunning, right? A condemnation of the entire restaurant sector to say, cook at home because you can't trust what's in a restaurant. That is an astonishing condemnation of the rest of the dietary quality in restaurants. But the same is true for packaged goods. So we've begun, of course, to have disclosure requirements, nutrient facts panels. We've begun to have front of pack label requirements. We have in the United States some quite substantial front of pack and health claim regulation. And of course, we also have process regulation, such as the ban on trans fats, industrial trans fats in foods. So clearly, like, that's what this is about. Again, maybe it's obvious to you that that's what this is about, but it's just really important to be aware. So what are we doing to think about next steps beyond the data I've shared with you? Trying to understand time use, trying to understand cost of meal preparation. Very, very difficult. Because of course, cooking is a joint activity with childcare, and cooking different foods is often a joint activity. So any ideas, thoughts you have about meal preparation as a factor in food choice that could be understood and modeled and predicted would be very interesting. But I hope I've persuaded you that it's at least interesting to think about this from an economics perspective, in the sense of building modeling tools, just software that can identify the least cost items and tell you where prices are expensive. So we get a lot of insight into which items. You saw the examples in the 4 countries I showed you. We have some insight into which populations are unable to afford, even if prices are normal. And we have some insights into which food groups and which types of foods are the unhealthy things that displace the foods for health. So clearly, it's like a lot of different things to be done to both understand and also devise interventions that can address the challenge. So I see people have not entered things in the chat, but we do have 10 minutes, I think.
Yes, we do.
Should be good.
Yeah. So thank you so much. That was great. Really appreciated that. Do we have any questions? Anybody want to start with questions? Like to ask? We have in the chat, Eduardo Samoas from University of Missouri wants to make sure he gets your email before you leave. Thank you, Eduardo. We'll make sure we share that. So
good. I'll put it in the chat right now. Thank you.
Okay, Shariki, do you have a question?
Yes, sure. This was a great presentation. I was listening, and I'm going to look at that report. How are your calculations affected by the import-export factors that affect availability in a particular country?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do have one study that was commissioned by the FAO specifically on the degree to which imports matter. And the answer is that they absolutely do, but in a somewhat surprising way, in the sense that countries do import final foods, but what's much more important is the import of the ingredients. And the ingredients in their final food industry, in their food sector, in their food businesses, are a pretty small share of the retail price. So what's driving diet costs around the world is, yes, if they do have access to the ingredients for their food industry, is there open trade for wheat and so forth? But then it's really, what is their bakery sector doing? What is their fruit and vegetable distribution sector doing? What is their transportation and storage and the retailing environment? And when you have a country that is underinvesting in its basic infrastructure, its marketplaces, you just have high retail costs. So I don't know what St. Louis or other cities, exactly what the shopping infrastructure looks like, but there was a lot of federal and state and municipal dollars went into making it easy for traders to bring food into a distribution hub, and have a wholesale market grow to serve the city at low margins. And so the way I would answer the question is, it's really important to have access to the basic ingredients through trade. But our food systems lens, if you will, is revealing that most of the action is in this retailing and distribution that determines the cost level for consumers even more than the ingredient cost does. The ingredient cost matters. So if you're in a situation where there's the risk of it getting cut off, you know, so the bakeries are going to have to close entirely or something like that. That's obviously terrible. And then there's some foods for which the traded product itself is not transformed very much. So that would be vegetable oils and then rice. You know, the markup is not that big. So those two, the local consumers are much more vulnerable to the price fluctuations in the world.
Yeah, well, I don't see anything on the chat. If I could just follow up, that I think what I'm trying to get at, and I mean, I don't know how to ask the questions, like, why do my colleagues in New Zealand tell me that they export most of the foods they grow because it's cheaper to get them?
Oh, I see.
That sort of thing, you know?
I see. Yeah, right. So, so New Zealand, you know, as one might imagine, is, you know, vastly more sheep than people and so forth. It's a, you know, I mean, I've never been actually. Maybe you haven't, you know, sort of seen it, but it's relatively underpopulated, so they didn't allow that much immigration to it. And they, you know, and it's just an agriculturally enormously productive land area. So it's akin to, you know, I don't know, you know, the Midwest of the US in the sense that it's just, you know, astounding. So it's, you know, much less greenhouse gas emissions and cost if you just get butter from New Zealand, because it's just sunshine and rain growing all that grass to feed the cows, and the butter is just very, very low cost, you know, when you get it from New Zealand. So it's quite natural that you would have some places that specialize in agriculture and export a lot of what they grow. And of course, they don't grow everything, right? They grow a lot of dairy, grow a lot of meat. I don't actually know the mix would be. But yeah, so around the world, most agricultural products are highly concentrated in the location within countries and also across countries. So there's a growing area, right? A region of origin for each type of food. You know, in the US, for example, fruits come from what we call the fruitful rim of the US, around the West Coast, Southeast. And then our grains come from the middle, and our dairy comes from the North and the South. So you can imagine that everything has a region of origin that's more or less concentrated. Some of our food supply is very highly concentrated because it's very technologically intensive. So our lettuce industry, for example, is a very high-tech industry. It's grown in the desert. Our lettuce is best grown in the desert. And so there's literally 2 counties in the United States that produce, you know, 95% of our lettuce in the winter. Then in the summer, it comes from more varied locations. But in Arizona and in Southern California, because those are super dry deserts, right? And there's a very low pest, and so that's why we get all our lettuce from there. But then, you know, each place wants a diverse diet, so we tend to import. So most, you know, everywhere in the world imports a lot of their food because we want a more diverse diet than we can grow. But yeah, it's a great question, great sort of topic.
So just as probably a final question, because we're almost out of time, I was struck by the you know, you had shown how so much of the food is all around branding. You know, there's so much branding that goes on. You also described we've got generations now that have been exposed to foods which are branded in certain ways and have really informed their diet and their parent diets. And we're really talking about ultra processed foods in many ways that are going to really be what people get, what they want, whether they can afford something else, what they go for. As someone who works in intervention in communities and really tries to encourage positive habits, and where where do we intervene? I mean, the companies have such a big role to play in this. Yeah, such a big role. I feel so many times like we're swimming upstream, because in the end, I do think the branding of the products and especially over generations of time, what happens and how it changes how people think. I mean, we have almost 80% of the country has diabetes or pre-diabetes. I mean, we're talking a pandemic in many ways. So where do you think the levers are to really hit to get the most effect, or who do we bring to the table, or who do we not bring to the table, if that's even a possibility? If that's a big question, big picture, but just a parting thought I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I mean, the total advertising budget, just the advertising, right? Not just the signage, at the establishment, but it just dwarfs CDC and NIH. It's a little more than CDC and NIH combined in total, right? And it dwarfs anything that they ever do in nutrition. And it absolutely dwarfs anything that's done in SNAP-Ed, or, even as big as they are, it's vastly larger. So clearly you can't bring a pea shooter to a, howitzer fight. It is true that the dietary guidelines for Americans are unusually effective at relatively low budget in reaching many people, thanks to classroom walls and teachers and schools. We're able to get the dietary guidelines out in a remarkably good way, at low cost compared to the cost of, buying television ads or something. But, having it be on the shoulders of a person to make the healthy choice when these other foods are so relentlessly sold to them is a heck of a thing to ask of people.
Right.
It is. And so that's not how we did auto safety. Telling people to always drive carefully, like, that's not how we did it. I mean, we do that, right? But we required airbags, right? And we experimented with lots of things before we got to airbags. People who are, my age or older, we remember riding around without any seat belts, and then we remember the lap belts, and we remember the shoulder belts, and we remember this and that. Finally, we got to the system we have now. But there's many other things, examples of, say, fire safety. How did we get to low fire incidents in the United States? Building codes, what's inside your walls, the government gets to tell you to tear down the construction. Like, they'll literally tell you, like, they'll inspect the inside of your wall, they'll say you didn't do it right, you got to tear it down, because it doesn't meet fire codes. And that's how we got to low fire. So the question for food is really, to what extent are people willing to treat more different things the way we did trans fats? How will we proceed towards sodium reduction? How will we proceed towards refined grain and added sugar reduction? How will we proceed towards, all of the dietary quality standards that we now know could achieve consensus, could be potential areas of consensus. So finding the areas of consensus that allow you to get agreement, with food industry, such that they all change at the same time. No one wants to be the first to reduce sodium, but if others do, they can too, right? And that's how we got to auto safety. That's how we got to housing and low fire. And we've improved the food supply a lot by removing trans fats and many other things. And it comes down, I think, to this amazing evidence base that people have developed, despite the fact that we can't do randomized trials of foods for people. And the epidemiological evidence is very hard to tease out. We do have some nutrition knowledge to share and to use to guide policy.
That's a fairly positive note.
Well, that's how I read the evidence. I don't know. You're within it. You may be more focused on the controversy and less on the areas of agreement.
Yeah. Well, that's good though. That's good to always think of the areas of agreement, because you're right. That's where you can at least move the needle. So well, I want to thank you very much. This was great. It was a wonderful presentation, and I appreciate so much your time for doing this, Dr. Masters. And Debra said to make sure that she thanked you as well. So I'm thanking on her behalf.
Thank you, Debra. Thanks everybody for joining.
Okay. Thank you.
Take care.